All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Fueling Collaboration, our season finale for season 3, Fire and Water. I'm going to give a couple minutes for folks to come in. And as they're coming in, I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. Give you all just a couple of minutes. So we're wondering what perspective you have coming into the discussion. This will help us form the discussion a little bit as we're doing it on the fly. And just where you're zooming in from, what region you're joining us from. We'll give those just a couple of minutes. Not even minutes, just a few seconds. All right, I'm going to end the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, so perspective coming into this discussion looks like we're comfortable with fire science and management and less with water. And our other big category is familiar with both fire science and or management. And a few that are just excited to be here. I love that. That's me. Mostly we're coming from the Northeast and Southeast US. That's what we expect, especially with the partners that are part of this. So I'm going to stop sharing those results here and go ahead and kick us off. All right, so as I said, you're here for the Fire and Water discussion of Fueling Collaboration Season 3. My name's Jen Bunty. I'm the Public Info Coordinator for the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists. And Fueling Collaboration is a partnership. It's a collaboration. Not only are we trying to encourage collaboration, but we are one on our own between the U.S. Forest Service's Northern and Southern Research Stations, CAFM's, my organization, the Lake States Fire Science Consortium, the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, also known as NAFC, Oak Woodlands and Forest Fire Consortium, the Southern Fire Exchange, and the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium. All these consortia and exchanges, we're all part of the Joint Fire Science Program's Fire Science Exchange Network. And these are our organizers, our incredible team that put these together. There's a lot of people behind the scenes, a lot of moving parts to keep these discussions going. And I'm just so grateful to be a part of this team. Every chance we get to meet is awesome. And we put on a great season this year, if I do say so myself. And thank you all, participants and registrants and panelists, for a great third season. Just a couple quick reminders before I pass it over to our moderator, Stephanie. The Talking About Fire, our first episode for this season, the recording and resources are now available, and Fire and Wildlife and Fire and Prescribed Burning in the WUI are going to be available very soon. And we will be emailing out those links to the people who have registered. If you are here and you're hoping to get continuing ed credits, this discussion is approved for 1.5 CEUs with the Society of American Foresters. Please make sure that your name is correct in the participant list, and we'll put in some instructions in the chat for how to do that if you're not sure. And please send us your feedback. We'll be sharing an evaluation link at the end, and that helps us form future discussions and just see how we're doing and make sure we are meeting your needs. A couple other quick housekeeping things. Please feel free to utilize the chat if you have questions or comments or resources to share. That's one of the best parts about Fueling Collaboration, is that our chat is usually, forgive the fire pun or don't forgive it, the chat is usually on fire. So feel free to use it, feel free to connect with each other, and we will be hitting some of those questions later in the discussion. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Stephanie, if you're ready.
I am ready, and check on audio, Jen, just to triple check. We have good. Can I get an okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, seeing thumbs up, great. So I'm Stephanie Laster. I'm with the Southern Research Station. Just a kudos to the team that's behind the scenes. As Jen mentioned, this is the final panel for this season. Ton of work for the folks that were on that slide, and just a round of applause for everybody for this panel season. Been really, really great. Feel free to put questions in the chat pod. Today, this is fire and water. I was trying to queue up a Name That Tune. I'll save that for the end. That might have something to do with fire and water. We'll close out with that song. We are going to, without any delay, go straight to our panelists. I have a series of questions, and thanks to all of you who registered and submitted questions. It's really helpful. And then we'll also be sure to take questions from the chat pod. So you're welcome to drop those in as we go through. If I'm looking left, it's because I'm looking at 2 monitors. So I'm not ignoring the screens, just to want to own that. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists and start off with Dr. Stephen Brantley. So Stephen, if you guys would introduce yourself, where you're from, and you can either take on a fire water myth, mythbuster, or name your favorite watershed. If you'd rather do that, that's fine too. So go for it, Stephen.
Sure. I'm Dr. Stephen Brantley. I'm down here in Southwest Georgia at the Jones Center in Itchaway. Real quick, if you're not familiar with the Jones Center, we are a 30,000 acre privately owned research center with that focuses on longleaf pine, and we have a very short fire return interval. We burn about 12,000 acres a year our whole property is burned on a 2-year rotation. So we know quite a bit about prescribed fire and less about wildfire. My role here as an ecohydrologist is to really see how forest management with fire fits into the Flint River Basin, which I'm going to cheat and do both and say that's my favorite river basin. But I also wanted to tackle the idea of myths. And I don't know if this is really a myth as much as a misconception or just maybe a different mission. But one of the things you'll hear a lot about water is human water supplies. And I think at the Jones Center here, we have sort of the luxury that we don't necessarily have to justify our water research based on human water supplies. We actually do a lot of work on aquatic ecosystems and how will water shortages and water supplies and water-centric restoration affect restoration of aquatic ecosystems. So that's my intro.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephen. Good morning, Kathy. I'll go to you next.
Hi, everyone. I am Kathy Haas. I'm the coordinator for the Southeastern Partnership for Forests and Water. And what I try to do is convene and support stakeholders, a wide swath of them, forest and water focused agencies and nonprofits, professional associations, academia, and then corporations and utilities, and bring everybody together to try and find where their objectives overlap and where we can make progress in getting funding and getting projects going, all for the purpose of protecting and managing forests for drinking water's sake. So I've got a little bit of tunnel vision when it comes to source water protection. And the protecting forests part of our discussions is a lot more common, the land acquisition and conservation easements and things. But the management of forests is where some of the nuance comes in. And that's where prescribed burns and BMPs and sustainable logging is discussed. So that's an important part of that management component. And I'm here to learn as much as I am to talk. And so I'm based in East Tennessee, and so I'm going to say the Tennessee River Basin is my favorite watershed. And firewater myth, I had an interesting story recently. The relationship with the public when it comes to prescribed burns is often contentious. There's a lot of people that don't understand its purpose and they're afraid of it. And so there's a utility in Arkansas that does prescribed burns. And she told me a story where they had started out, they were getting a lot of complaints and concerned citizens and a lot of uproar about what they were doing. But they developed a message for their community, and they stayed on that message and kept it consistent. There's an email list, there are postcards they send out, and they say specifically when they're going to be doing burning, where, for how long, and why. And most importantly, why they're doing that burning and how it benefits them. And this last season that they did prescribed burns, they got 0 complaints from the community. So I think that's inspiring for all of us, and wanted to dispel that myth that it's futile.
I love that example. Thank you, Kathy. Dr. Kolka, go to you next.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to be on the panel today. Yeah, I'm Randy Kolka. I'm a research soil scientist with the Northern Research Station in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. And I've been working on fire for almost 20 years now, and mainly looking at the effect of fire, both prescribed and wild, on carbon, nutrient, and mercury cycling. Specifically in this part of the world, northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, upper peninsula of Michigan, but also have ongoing work in Indonesia and Africa as well, looking at fire effects on soils. The myth, I think I'm going to leave because I think it's going to be dispelled during the call today. I have a little story though. I have a favorite watershed too, but I have a little story. It's kind of neat. 2 years ago, my wife and friends and I were up in the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness area, and I highly recommend anyone that hasn't been there to go there for a week. And I'm sitting on a rock with a cool drink, with a bobber and a leech out there floating, fishing for walleyes if you're a walleye fisherman. And I looked up and I saw some smoke off in the distance. And I had a little cell phone coverage, so I called a buddy on the Superior National Forest, and he called the dispatch. And within a half an hour, there was a plane overhead, and within a half an hour after that, they were dropping chemical. And so I got an accommodation from Smokey Bear as a member of the public for finding the Delta Lake fire that ended up burning 69 acres in the Boundary Waters.
Great story. I love it. Thank you, Randy. All right, Dr. Jim Bode.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I am a longtime ecosystem scientist in the Southern Research Station. Did a lot of work at the Coweta Hydrologic Lab, looking at fire effects, both prescribed and wild, on ecosystem properties, with water resources being one of them, for sure. More recently, a lot of work on watershed function in general and climate change. I retired, at least from the Forest Service, in 2020, so about 3 years ago. And I guess I would consider myself to be semi-retired at this point. I'm still teaching at the university and doing some consulting and collaboration with colleagues. Again, happy to be here and happy to share some of my experiences with fire and water and watershed function. Stephanie asked about myths or surprises and that kind of thing, and I'm sure I know I'm the oldest one on this panel, and I'll say nothing surprises me much anymore. But I do have a perspective that I would like to share, because it's something that myself and colleagues have been thinking about, and I think it's important for all of us to think about. And that often we're sort of tied to the concept of what the forest looks like now and what it might have looked like 100 years ago or 200 years as our guide going forward. And my work with climate change and seeing things change abruptly and surprises happen, I think more these days about not the historic range of variability, but the future range of variability. And not desired future conditions, but achievable future conditions within that future range of variability or variation. I think this is not necessarily novel, but often we get anchored to the current, to the past. And from my perspective, even in discussion today, we really need to look to the future. What's the world going to be like, best we can tell, in 50 to 100 years, and how do we manage to have resilient forests under those conditions? All right, that's all. Thanks.
Great, thank you all. So for those joining us, this panel was originally scheduled for December, speaking of water, and we had some crazy snowstorms that day happening and disrupting. And I think, again, today, we're probably, some of you guys are experiencing some epic snows, Randy, so stay warm. What I think I'll do is work through, we had a lot of questions that were on just foundational science behind burning, watershed impacts, forest impacts on burning, and water quantity and quality. So I have a few questions on some of the science part of it. And then we have a few questions on the management impacts, and then sort of how we work with our public agencies and public perception. So I'm going to sort of walk through this in that kind of sequence. And again, I'll watch the chat for those joining us. If you have additional questions, if you want to put those in there, our team and myself are paying attention to make sure we take those. So I'll just jump right in. So the first question was just in general, how does fire impact water quality? Is there evidence that burned versus unburned stands impact water quality in a negative way? So I'm just going to throw that. I'm not going to call on y'all, let anybody jump in and take it, but a general question on impacts to quality. Yeah, hop in. You don't need to raise your hand.
I'll go ahead and start, and I know these others have comments as well. And so that's an important question, been asked for a long time. And usually we give these kinds of answers that are a little frustrating, but this is definitely one that says it all depends. And it depends on a couple things, but probably the most important one is how severe the fire is. And usually, and severity is a measure of how much is really the impacts parameter. How much forest floor is consumed, how much vegetation is killed. It's what happens with the fire. And I think it's probably reasonable, and the science I think supports this, that most prescribed fires are below enough severity that the impacts on water quality are negligible and or short-term. On the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, wildfires will typically, though not always, have much higher fire severity, impacts the forest floor, impacts the vegetation processes that hold on to those nutrients. And it's under those circumstances usually that you would have measurable effects on water quality in the context of sediment, water quality in the context of nutrients. How bad that is and how long that lasts depends on severity. It also depends on luck, because often when you get big pulses of sediment, ash, etc., after a wildfire, it's a wildfire that was followed up by a really big rainstorm before the system has had a chance to recover. And so sort of the perfect storm is a severe wildfire near a stream and big rainstorms. And in those situations, yes, there can be measurable negative impacts on water quality. So that's my perspective.
Just to go off what
Randy,
Jim said
yeah,
a little bit. Yeah, the severity is obviously the most critical parameter you need to worry about. Not to say though that a prescribed fire couldn't be as severe, if not more severe, than a wildfire, depending on the goals of the prescribed fire. Not uncommon, but and then the other thing that really goes into the equation as far as the impacts on the stream is not just the severity, but the extent in the watershed. And so if you have a watershed that's completely burned, that might have a different influence on water quality than one that is burnt in some part or area of it. And specifically, if you have riparian zones that are burned, I mean, that's a whole different story too. So yeah, just to agree with Jim, but also to add that it's the extent of the watershed and the severity that really are the combination that you got to look at.
I'll add a little bit to that. Oh, sorry.
Great. Go, Stephen. Sorry.
One factor that luckily we don't have to deal with here, watershed characteristics like slope, elevation, those things have a huge impact. So down here in South Georgia where it's flat, you know, even if we had a huge wildfire, I'm not sure that we would see the kind of effects in sedimentation, for instance, that you would see in Colorado. I'll just speak from experience. Most of my focus is on water quantity, but from a quality standpoint, when we burn and we do prescribe fire constantly. We also have about 100 acres, 100 individual isolated wetlands. And we'll burn those wetlands right up to the edge. And if it's dry enough, we'll burn all the way through those wetlands. And I think Jim hit on it when he said that the effects were small from prescribed fire and also very temporary. So temporary within a few days, we might see some changes in water chemistry. But really the proof is in the long-term maintenance of the system. And if we don't burn that frequently, you risk having a wildfire on the landscape, or you risk the wetland drying up because there's too much evapotranspiration in the watershed. So I think if there's an argument to be made for prescribed fire having, a low impact on water quality, we're a pretty good example of that.
So on that same note and that thread, you guys, let's talk a little bit about specifically some differences in sediment loading or nutrient loading in regards to prescribed fire versus wildfire, and your experiences with that. Stephen, you might be able to pick up on the question there.
So I actually have some, very recent data on this. It's not me, but a colleague. Again, we've burned around some of these wetlands dozens of times, maybe 50 times in the last century since this landscape's being burnt. From a sedimentation standpoint, we've done some coring in some of the wetlands, and we can date those cores, and in 150 years, we've had about 10 centimeters of sedimentation. That is a very, very low rate of sedimentation. So my guess would be, at least for prescribed fire, it really is not contributing anything to sedimentation. And that's about the extent of my knowledge on it, though.
I would say everything we just said about water quality pretty much applies to sediment and sediment transport as well. It's all about the severity and the extent of the watershed that was burned. I think that's pretty applicable no matter what the water quality issue.
Yeah, I concur. I'll add that probably for better, not worse, we have a lot of data on prescribed fire water quality responses. We don't have as much data on wildfire water quality responses, especially in some parts of the wetter parts of the southern eastern United States. But where we do have data, where wildfires have occurred, and there has been an opportunity to put in sampling systems and measure responses, they're there. I mean, there is clearly a risk, even though it is from a limited amount of data in some parts of the eastern United States. It's pretty definitive that, as Randy and Stephen have said, that if you have a severe fire in a place that has a little bit of topography and can have some decent storms post-fire, we don't observe it with prescribed fire, but it has been observed with wildfire. So that risk is real and something to try and avoid.
This is a great question on sort of the ecohydrologic aspect. And the question was, what does stream flow look like in a xeric versus a mesic system? So if I have a scenario in my watershed that's fire prone and fire needed versus a different watershed that's wetter, the stream flow looks the same with prescribed fire in those two situations.
I guess, again, generalities, but usually the drier the system, the more pronounced the fire impact will probably be, given the same severity, even though those are the ecosystems that have been developed with fire and they're, to develop the ecosystem structure. Given it's the same fire, you're going to have more impacts on a more xeric community versus a mesic community, I think.
I think this is a complex question that gets into a little bit of, you know, the defining characteristics of what you mean by mesic and xeric. And, you know, we've I've worked in a couple of ecosystems now where we talked about xeric species and xeric species or xeric communities, and, you know, right next door, maybe on a different slope or maybe in a different soil type, you had a more mesic community. I think you can have more effects on xeric communities, but I think those xeric communities are a little bit more water conservative to begin with. So, you know, I think about a lot of the xeric oaks we have down here on some of the sandhill sites tend to be ring porous species, whereas a lot of more mesic species are diffuse porous species, and so they have higher rates of transpiration. So, in a way, if you compare these two sites, everything kind of evens out. And so maybe the fire effect is higher on the xeric site, but then because the system is using less water to begin with, your stream flow is going to be about the same. So I guess what I'm saying is ET is going to balance things out based on the system. Now, I'm always curious, this relationship sort of between a xeric and water conservative vegetation community and a mesic, less water conservative, you know, vegetation community that also shows, you know, susceptibility to fire in the mesic community or not in the xeric community. Is that a coincidence, or is there something there long term that's evolved? But yeah, I think a lot of times it tends to even out.
Yeah. This is complex and I think really difficult to generalize, because it really all depends on mortality, right? I mean, the water balance is going to be dependent upon how much water the trees are using. And typically, you know, wildfire may adjust infiltration a little bit and may adjust soil evaporation a little bit, but where the rubber mostly hits the road is mortality. And so I can envision is that, you know, a wildfire that causes a lot of mortality in a mesic forest, if it did, I'd have to have kind of unique situations where it'd be a pretty severe fire, could have a pretty substantial impact on hydrology. Maybe not in the short term, but in the long term as those trees died over the years. But I think it really is a very complicated question that depends on the stand composition at the time of the fire, the size class distribution and their vulnerability to fire, the type of fire, whether it's, you know, the season of the burn. I mean, this is a great question, but I think a difficult one to answer other than sort of anecdotally. And maybe that's just where we are in terms of our understanding is anecdotally, but I suppose that as more and more wildfires occur in different types of systems, as the environment changes and they become more vulnerable, we'll have more than anecdotal information. But at this point, I think that's a tough nut to crack.
Well, I like appreciate the explanation on, yeah, the impacts of mortality, the differences. Some folks, I'm not sure, we have a huge group of folks joining us today that may not be as familiar with a mesic versus a xeric system. So that was a great answer to help understand that. I'm going to switch over and talk a little bit about exclusion of fire. So question was, seems some folks, specialists in my watershed are hesitant or outright against igniting in a riparian area. And so can you talk about maybe is there a happy middle there, or why the hesitancy? And that's sort of for the rest of the group here, why we started with naming some myths, because as we were developing this panel, we've kind of talked about those myths out there about impacts to quantity or quality, and maybe that's not actually held up in the literature. So talk about exclusion and helping our public and our managers understand that maybe that's not the best way forward. Off that to whoever wants to take it.
I'll take a crack at that. You know, from our perspective, where we're putting a lot of fire on the ground, but we also have some sensitive aquatic systems. Even we only burn up to within a certain distance of our creeks and rivers. And some of that, I think that's less an issue of water quality and more an issue of the fact that, you know, right next to the creek, and I'm talking about anywhere from say 2 meters to 50 meters, you know, that direct riparian zone, that's actually where a lot of our tree biodiversity is. And that's where a lot of our species are that don't occur in the uplands. And so there's a practical reason to the fact that those stands that are right there by the creek don't carry fire very well, because those are more mesic species. You know, their leaf litter is not meant to dry out the way some of the xeric species is. It's not good fuel. But also, I mean, I think there's a level, even with us, where we want to protect the biodiversity of those riparian zones. And so we'll, you know, we exclude those areas intentionally.
I'll go ahead and add a little bit about the idea of fire in riparian zone. You know, I think it's reasonable to think that the riparian zone is and should be treated different than the upland, because just a practical standpoint, that riparian zone is so important for protecting water quality, regardless of what the upland or away from disturbance is, that it just has unique functions and unique roles, a critical spot in any watershed. So thinking about very carefully what should and shouldn't happen in a riparian zone, I think it's good. And as Stephen alluded to, I mean, it's also typically a hotspot of a lot of biodiversity, and you know, could have some unintended consequences of not deeply thinking about fire in the riparian zones. On the other hand, I'm sure, and I think there's data to support it, that throughout history, whether on purpose or accidentally, fire has been in riparian zones. Probably a very different fire regime than the upland system. But I suspect that under certain conditions, when it's dry enough and the weather's hot enough and windy enough, and there's an ignition source, that historically fires did occur in the riparian zone. But I don't think it would be the same as the upland. You know, in other words, in a hardwood forest, I don't think you'd necessarily want to have the same fire regime, prescribed fire regime in a riparian zone as you would in upland. And then the only other point I make, which kind of leads back to my introductory comment about thinking about the future and less about the past. You know, it may be that in 50 years or 100 years, as climate change continues to progress and climate extremes get greater and we have deeper and more widespread droughts, that there is a risk of riparian zones burning in wildfires, a greater risk. And because of their importance, maybe thinking about how to manage that risk now would be a good idea. And maybe prescribed fire is one of those ways to manage that risk. Anyway, I think it is something, though, that requires some pretty careful thinking, just because of the critical role those areas play in watersheds for maintaining water quality and enhancing diversity in wildlife corridors and those kinds of things.
Kathy, I want to get you in on this piece too, that, you know, what do you hear from other agencies and partners or the messaging around riparian areas, if I can pull your voice into that conversation from a partnership and engagement standpoint?
I think that that almost falls into more of the nuanced part of the message that I was talking about. And And honestly, in some of these conversations, you want to avoid that because you never want to give an example and say that this is, everybody understands that this is the case, and then have people coming up and saying, well, in our watershed, it's a little bit different, or our water source has a different experience with that. So you want to avoid that. That's what I've done, is avoid the nuanced part of that and leave that to the scientists that are talking today and the more technical discussions. So you want to emphasize the conservation message as a whole is, very well accepted by a lot of different audiences. And what I'm trying to do is bring in all of those different audiences. So if you can pull out the things like the benefits and emphasize those, the flowers that come up after you do a prescribed burn, and focus on those with some of the audiences and tailor your message to your audience.
So Randy and Stephen, you both specifically mentioned burning in bogs or up to wetlands, Stephen. So when it comes to that part, that specific water type, talk a little bit more about, there's a couple questions in the chat pod too about bogs, impacts to nutrients around bogs or peatlands, and burning around wetlands. So I'll throw that to both of you.
I'm a little bit hesitant to take that on because, like what Kathy just said, I think we're all specialists in our own ecosystem, and so I saw the question about southeastern Appalachian bogs, and it gets back. There's some generalities you can talk about. What's your fuel load? How much of the watershed are you going to burn? And what's the topography around that body of water? What's the climate? If you do really want to burn, or someone's planning on burning, make sure they take mitigation, that they mitigate risk in such a way that maybe they're not burning during the wet season, or maybe they're burning during a time of year when soils are a little bit drier and the vegetation is going to come back. So you might favor a growing season burn, but that for me, that's entirely speculation, not really having worked on wetlands in those systems. But yeah, there's a lot to consider.
There's definitely been a movement afoot by managers in the lake states, the Western Great Lakes here, to start burning prescribed fire and peatland ecosystems. And I haven't seen any data to suggest that it's a good thing, to be honest. Surface burns might be okay, but even at that, you're not contributing to the carbon pool in these ecosystems on any sort of scale. And if you do happen to have a fire that gets out of hand, or you have a severe burn, you are losing tons and tons and tons of carbon that have been stored for thousands of years, and you're not going to get it back anytime soon. And so be very careful about burning peatlands or next to peatlands. You definitely don't want to get the burns into the peatlands of any significance. Like I say, there might be some management concerns that might be beneficial for burning, having a light burn across the peatland for various veg management purposes. But again, it's not going to help in any sort of way as far as sequestering carbon or nutrients or mercury or any of those things that are put up in the atmosphere as a result of burning of these peatlands. So maybe not necessarily a myth, but I think it's a good idea generally to stay out of the peatlands. And if you do just do light burns, history says that at least in this part of the world, the light burns probably happen on the order of every 30 to 50 years. But the big burns that actually influence soil peat and burned into the peat, they're on the order of 1,000 years. And so, we're seeing events like the Greenwood fire, for example, last year up in northern Minnesota that burned this peatland that would have a return interval of 1,000 years. And it's a result of what Jim has been talking about. It's the way that we're going to be in the future, and it's our influence on climate and on these ecosystems that for centuries have been carbon sinks, and they are becoming sources in some cases, especially because of our warm falls. During the fall, the carbon that's been sequestered is released back to the atmosphere. And so when the plants senesce in September, the carbon that's all been put in the soil up to that point in the season is there. And then the microbes, though, in a warm fall, keep decomposing that carbon. And so in a couple of circumstances, we've actually seen these ecosystems flip from being sinks to sources. But even if they're not as big a sinks as they used to be because of various reasons, mainly climate change, that's still a huge impact on our global carbon cycle. So I'll get off the peatland bandwagon now.
Well, I'm actually going to keep pushing you, Randy, because there's a lot of questions about nutrient cycling and impacts on water quality from burning, and specifically around nutrient cycling. What are the benefits of fire as it pertains to nutrient cycling? We actually had a fair number of questions on that. So can I tag you to give us the nutrient cycling 101?
Specifically for peatlands?
Yeah, and any other aspects that you want to touch on if you want to bring up. I know you've been a career.
Yeah, so one of the main issues related to peatland burning is we see a big influx or outflux, I should say, of dissolved organic carbon following burns. And that is associated with quite a few available nutrients and some things. We never see anything related to sediment or any of those sort of influences or impacts, but there definitely is some dissolved water quality concerns if you have a severe fire on peatlands. But it's mainly the nutrients and it's mainly the DOC and the nutrients that are associated with the DOC. And the one thing that's also associated with the DOC, and this is actually my myth, is mercury. And we haven't talked about mercury, but mercury is a really important water quality concern and should be. And there wasn't a question on this actually. But most folks know mercury bioaccumulates in the food chain, and fire has shown to have some effects on mercury. But the one thing that we found that's been really good news is, we had multiple studies going on in the boundary waters in northern Minnesota, and up to severe, or I should say less than severe, so up from slight to moderate, either wildfires or prescribed fires, did not lead to more mercury bioaccumulated in the fish in the lakes in those systems. So again, it's a good thing, but if you get that severe wildfire, we're not still sure. And my hunch is there would be impacts on a severe wildfire. We just haven't had the opportunity to sample it yet.
Stephanie, I'll add a little context for sort of temperate eastern deciduous forests from our work on nutrient responses to prescribed fire especially. And there's a lot of things that go on when a fire passes through the forest floor and begins to consume the carbon and nutrients or whatever's in the leaves in the forest floor. I'll just talk a little bit about nitrogen, because that's often a nutrient that's limiting to forests, and we worry about losses of nitrogen from a forest productivity standpoint and inputs of nitrogen to streams from a stream health standpoint. But basically, when you get a fire that comes through, you're going to lose some nitrogen from the site and some other elements too. Part of it is there's volatilization. So when that heat consumes that organic matter, nitrogen will volatilize and leave in a gaseous form. Some of it leaves in the smoke, in particulate. Some of it goes down into the soil itself, just due to the gradient in concentration, and moves into the soil itself. And so there's often a slight decrease in what's above ground in the unavailable organic form, and an increase in what's available below ground in the inorganic form. If the vegetation is still there or is recovering, that's a benefit to the vegetation. If the vegetation isn't active and doesn't take it up, sometimes you can see a small little signal from that nitrogen in the stream. But again, it's always low and always short term. So fires are transforming or altering nutrient cycling processes in pools a little bit, at least for a little while. And certainly, immediately after the fire, there are some changes. Those tend to recover pretty quickly as long as there's not substantial amounts lost like you'd have in a fire, just due to atmospheric deposition, just due to nitrogen fixation, just due to increased productivity and cycling of nutrients in the roots and the leaf matter of the vegetation that recovers. So, I think under, and Stephen will probably talk about this, but in real frequently burned systems like longleaf pine, the ground vegetation is a big contributor and replacer of that nitrogen. A lot of nitrogen fixers in frequently burned systems. So the systems kind of have adapted to recovering quickly from that to mitigate any negative impacts on water quality. And I think that's been shown over and over again, right after one burn, right after 50 years of burning, the nutrient cycling processes hold those nutrients on the site, no long-term negative impact. But I do concur with Randy about some concerns, especially with wildfire, and one of them is the DOC. I don't know if there's been any strong examples in the East of worry about DOC with wildfires on drinking water treatability, but it is something that comes up. And it's certainly something that's of concern when you have really big wildfires, severe wildfires in places that are major contributing water for drinking water sources, and that's dealing with that DOC. And but that's another reason to prescribe burn is nutrient cycling processes are minimal. You don't want to get to the point where you're in a wildfire where they're maximum, and then you got lots of other problems to deal with.
I wanted to add one thing. I've been watching the chat box and some of the debate really that's going on about fire effects, especially about this burning up to the lakeshore. And, I think, again, it's an individual prescription. That's why we call it prescribed fire, because like a doctor gives you a drug for a specific problem for a specific time, this is a prescription. And if your prescription is in putting in prescribed fire is to avoid wildfire. So if you have a system that should have a fire return interval of 10 years and it hasn't burned in 100, then maybe that is a good site that you need to burn. Of course, the impact is going to be very different. Also, from a lot of my research, it shows that regular prescribed fire controls vegetation in such a way that it's actually going to put more water in the lake. So there could be a little bit of a dilution effect. Okay, so you're going to put in a little DOC and some nitrogen in a pulse right after the fire, but in the long term, if you're managing regularly with fire, you're going to have a better water yield in the system. And so I would kind of lean more heavily on not overgeneralizing and trusting the fire managers that are in that system, and hopefully they have been trained and hired and know what they're doing. It's good. It's great to question them, though. These are all great questions.
They are. And Randy, let's just pull it in. There's a great discussion in the chat about burning up to the shore. So let's keep going on that. So burning up to the shoreline. Good back and forth here about reasons why or not. So Randy, I'm just gonna put you on the spot to maybe expand on that comment.
Yeah, so I just sent a quick message to everyone there. Burning up to the lake, lakes have riparian zones too, right? And so burning up to the lake is the same as just burning up to the edge of the stream, more or less. And there's an important ecosystem there around the lake that's different than the upland potentially. And so all the things we talked about applying for riparian areas, riparian zones, applies to that area surrounding lakes as well, in my opinion.
Thank you. Keep the comments coming. This is great. I also have a question about on the same thread on wetlands. So differentiating between types of organic based wetlands. the wetlands that Steve mentioned. Right. So a little bit of a explanation on the difference there would be great.
Yeah, I guess was that to me? I think you broke up for a minute, but I'll take that. So we don't have peat wetlands. We don't have a lot of peat soils here. So we do burn not only up to the edge and even across the wetlands. One of the reasons for that, one of the prescriptive purposes, is to control woody vegetation, because if woody vegetation gets into the lake, and some of these are small lakes, it can increase evapotranspiration. The wetland has a lower hydro period. It makes it actually more susceptible to fire over time. But, if we were over in Southeast Georgia, in soils like the Okefenokee, where they have a lot of organic matter, where they have meters and meters of deep peat soil that can burn up and has, I don't know, I think about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a severe wildfire in the Okefenokee where peat burned for weeks, if not months. That would be an area where you would want to very much more carefully consider whether or not you were going to burn, because of the carbon loss, because of the uniqueness of those soils. But if you have wetlands that have less organic matter and you need to control woody vegetation and increase hydro period for whatever conservation goal you have for your property, then prescribed fire really is the way to go.
Thanks, Stephen. That is what I was trying to get at. So let's talk about prioritization. There was questions on how with all these factors we've talked about, the science behind it, and we're now implementing fire on the landscape. How do you prioritize a watershed? And what factors would you consider when you're implementing a burn? And the question was specific for protection. I want to make sure I captured that. Prioritizing a watershed for protection. I don't know the definition of protection in this specific question, but what I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
From a source water protection standpoint, I can chime in there that there are lots of different agencies at the state level and regional analyses that have already done this, especially the Forest Service Forest to Faucets, that have prioritized the watersheds based on their, proximity to drinking water intakes. And so there's at the state level, your state's water quality agency has to do a source water assessment plan. So, and then different conservation agencies or wildlife agencies or your forest agencies, they've all got their ways of prioritizing those watersheds. They've probably already done it based on different things. And so a lot of states have put together those prioritization models, and you can toggle different factors on and off. So you would say prioritizing based on, from one perspective, drinking water intakes, you toggle that layer on, it's going to show you a different map than another map. So a lot of those tools those analyses have already been done, and there's online tools in a lot of places to look at that very easily just from your desktop.
Any of the rest of you guys want to chime in on that one?
I think I was one that sort of pushed for this question to be included, but I know there are a lot broader viewpoints out there too, like what Kathy mentioned. But when I think of protection in the southeastern coastal plain, I'm thinking about restoration of longleaf pine and restoration of the burn cycle. And so one of the things we've worked on a lot in the Flint River Basin is the fact that there's a limited number of acres that we can affordably convert to longleaf pine and reintroduce fire on. So how do we prioritize those watersheds? And that really gets into how close it is to streams. If we want to reintroduce fire and manage an ecosystem for water yield, so to speak, and reintroducing fire is just part of that. We want that effort that we put in at the watershed level to be maximized, because that watershed is actually maybe a little bit closer to a creek, or has a little bit different geology. You know, we're in a karst system here, so we want that watershed to be connected to groundwater. We want it to be connected to the creek. And so we might burn and restore a little bit closer, or you know, the research on this is still ongoing though, so it's tricky. But when I think about protection, I'm thinking about protecting water quantity by restoring the native ecosystem that's here.
I think in a lot of cases for us up in the upper Great Lakes, there's veg management aspects obviously to it, and there's restoration, but there's also the aspect of disturbance and taking care of that disturbance, utilizing fire in some form or fashion. A big one that the Superior National Forest has been working on for over 25 years now, approximately 25 years, is the blowdown area. And it was just a powder keg of timber that was like matchsticks. And so disturbance is another driver for fire programs, at least in this part of the world. And blowdown is one of them. There's probably other disturbances as well that I'm not thinking of. So that's how they prioritize many times what they're going to do here.
So Kathy, I'm going to switch to an agency question we got around well, there's several actually. I'll start with this one. How do regulatory agencies and municipality boards understand the importance of prescribed fire in the watershed? Can you talk about your work in that arena?
Yeah, like I mentioned, I tend to avoid the real nuanced scientific side of that. But if you're trying, and honestly, a lot of these regulatory agencies, and especially the town regulatory boards, it's about the relationships that you have with them, and you want to get the right message to the right audience, and you want to have the right messenger. And if you want to be that messenger and talking to them, then I think it's important to really establish those relationships proactively. So don't wait until there's an issue that comes up. And then also you can make yourself out to be the expert in this, so that when an issue does come up, you're called to give your perspective to this, and they don't just hear from the loudest voices. And maintain those relationships widespread. You know, local policy, especially if it's a town regulatory board, policy is politics and politics is local. So if you've got the relationships and you're talking to all the different groups, if you're only talking to prescribed burn associations and forest stewardship councils, then you're preaching to the choir. So get out of that comfort zone and try to find those audiences that, you know, the Rotary clubs and the garden clubs, and talk to them, because they're meeting, you know, the second Tuesday of every single month, and you know, you'll get a free meal out of it possibly, and you talk to them and teach them about it. And you can start with a broader message about just forest protection on a basic level. You know, the Southeastern Partnership's tagline is healthy forests equals clean water. So that's about as simple as you can. There's a lot of ways that you can break that down and talk about it, but a healthy forest is a managed forest. So if you start with a broader message of just forest protection on a basic level, and then the next time you can talk a little bit about forest management, and then you can get into prescribed burns once they have a more general understanding of it. And elected officials are key, especially even with the regulatory agencies. You know, your city manager may not be on that board, but he's definitely talking to them on a regular basis. And so the more relationships that you can make and widespread in your community, the better off it's going to be when there's an issue that comes up that you need to really talk to them about. And you can be that trusted messenger.
I'm going to throw that to you, the other three of you too. Just anything you want to add? So Kathy, the follow-up question to that is emphasizing the benefits and sort of key messages. And you mentioned the Southeastern Partnership. Can you think of other examples from other nonprofits or agencies or regulatory agencies or whatever on key messages that helps the public understand the benefits? Are there sort of those communication tool successes that you can tout?
Well, there's some science that's going on right now, some research with Pete Caldwell and Keeping Forests, NC State, that is really looking at quantifying the benefits of forests to drinking water. So if you can create, they're hoping to develop a tool that's going to be able to help you really put a number on this, that you can talk to utilities and justify the work that's being done. But there are a lot of especially utilities that have developed, and municipal ones. Let's take the city of Raleigh. They've got a watershed protection fee that they add to their bill, and they've emphasized the message. They've got 2 reservoirs, and that's where their intakes are. But they have a whole website that's called upstreammatters.org. So what they do then is have you looking upstream, what's upstream of your drinking water, and how important those forests are to that and managing that. So they understood that the messaging component of looking upstream is critical to being able to justify what they're doing and what they're charging. And their focus really is conservation easements and land acquisition, but there's a lot of opportunity when we've talked a little bit about opportunities for increased partnerships. And so when you can expand just the conservation easements and acquisition, expand that out to the healthy forests and the management, then you can direct some of those funds that you're getting in creatively financed ways, take some of those funds and put them toward the management of the forests, including prescribed burns, but then have your science to back up why that's important.
Thanks, Kathy. So I'm going to switch to the chat pod. A couple of questions I'm catching here. One is back to water quality. Water quality is a general concept. I assume different parameters may respond differently. Are there tools to predict the trajectories, i.e. exports of DOC, nutrient, and sediments?
Well, there are, there are, and really the way you predict and project is with models, with nutrient cycling models that are able to accurately reproduce or reasonably reproduce the biophysical processes that change as a result of a prescribed fire or any kind of fire. And so, yeah, so there are some water quantity and water quality models that are out there to at least give some sideboards on what could happen. I think that the reality is, however, is that the responses are, that the actual responses are typically kind of site specific and fire specific and post-fire condition specific. So, if someone really wants to know what happened, you pretty much have to measure it. If you want to make a educated analysis of what might happen to help with that priority setting or decision making, there are modeling tools out there that can be used to at least give some unbiased projection of what might happen. And of course, with those kinds of models, if they're good models, you can actually look at various scenarios. What if I burned in the fall? What if I burned in the spring? What if I used a fire that consumed 10% or 30% of the litter load? So they're good not only for sort of projecting, but also doing some scenario analysis of perhaps different alternatives for fire and impacts on water quality. And Stephanie, you may remember you and I did this.
Yes, we did.
In North Carolina, yeah, looking at fires across North Carolina and used a model to look at impacts on nitrogen pool, potential impacts on nitrogen pools.
I'm not stepping out of the facilitator to comment on any of the.
What model was that, Jim? Was it a SWOT model?
That was Newcomb.
Okay.
That was that literally stands for the nutrient cycling model.
So
And,
my point is that, you know, I don't know of any model specific for fire impacts. Maybe there is out west, and I'm not aware of it. I'm not a modeler. But it's more of these off-the-shelf models. Newcomb is one of those. SWOT is another one. I don't know if Drain Mod would do something like this or not down in the southeast. And so there's tools out there, but I don't know of anything specific that's been designed to look at fire impacts specifically.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've been using the SWOT model for watershed restoration scenarios for a number of years now, and I honestly don't know if there is a parameter input in that model for really important parameters about like hydrophobicity of the soil and how that changes, or black carbon. And then the other thing about, you know, models are useful, but they're mostly, you know, generally wrong. What are you putting into the model? Do you have field data to calibrate the model with? Do you have field data to validate that calibration? And you know, models can be useful, but they need to have, one, the structure that your specific question needs, you know, so you might have to have a hydrophobicity, you know, parameter in it that might not exist in the current model at a watershed scale. And you know, you have to have the data to put in there, because, you know, one of our rules is garbage in, garbage out. So be careful about that. Using models inappropriately is a big pitfall.
Yeah, and I'd say, unfortunately, it's what we have. Until we have measurements of the future, our only way to estimate the future is with some kind of a predictive tool, with the appropriate, you know, caveats and realization of limitations and assumptions that have to go in, and modifications. I do agree with Randy. I'm not aware of any model that's specific to fire, but I am aware of models that can be modified enough to be able to produce a reasonable hypothesis of what might happen. You know,
Yeah, and I would just,
and if it's not
yeah.
reasonable, then it's not, you know, there's no value. So,
You know, you also have to be willing to, if you find that model that answers the questions you want answered, put the work in. You have to be willing to, or able to put the work in, and partner with people who can not only use the model, but can fill in those gaps with appropriate data.
yeah.
So Sharon had a question here about disturbance and the impacts on soil hydraulics, Randy, and just a question about beetle kill, widespread beetle kill compared with fire in terms of that. Any examples come to mind?
No.
Sharon, we're going to get back on that.
I'm racking way back. I can't pull anything out. Sorry.
That's great. So that's the beauty of we're just sitting around a table, right? Doing the fat on these. So we'll be able to do some digging and put things back in this chat pod, you guys. Another question about, you know, kind of back to this discussion that's been throughout the chat today. This person is struggling to find literature that can be used in discussion with managers specifically for prescribed fire in wet meadow or shrub swamp systems. So if you all have links that you can drop in at some point, or a reference off the top of your head, that's great. Otherwise, we'll make sure we can tag those in the chat. I'll pause a second while I look at the next one in case any of y'all can cite.
Well, yeah, I did. I wanted to quantify. I did drop a link in there for a paper I was involved in a couple of years ago about wetland restoration. And if you read, I just reread the abstract while y'all were talking. It does talk mainly about hardwood removal, but again, fire is a standard part of this landscape. And the way that watershed or that catchment around the geographically isolated wetland was managed. Fire was part of it already, but with the hardwood removal, that was really emphasized in the treatment that improved the application of fire. So don't think that was a misplaced link. That fire was definitely a big part of that restoration.
And Guy put in a link to the WEP model there. I see that as another model example. Thank you so much, Guy. There's some discussion around FRCC and some definitions, so that's helpful. You guys, any of y'all want to chime in on that? That was a thread. Okay. Brianna asks about, and she's in the western part, British Columbia, but talking about ways to mechanically treat debris pre-fire. So any that's a different system completely. And this whole just a reminder that this session is strategically thinking about the east, northern and southern parts of the east and fire. So it is quite different. But any conversation you guys want to mention about mechanical treatment, then applying fire?
We do it here for sure. We do it around our wetlands. I haven't seen the machine in action, but it's called a roller chopper. And we go through and take out small vegetation and then reintroduce fire. We have sort of a lot of the vegetation we have down here, because it is relatively wet, maybe not as wet as the Pacific Northwest, but it's very warm and we have long growing seasons. Vegetation grows fast. The vegetation can get out of hand really quickly. So 3 years plus, basically, fire may not be as effective at controlling some of the woody species that come in and replace our ground cover. So we use mechanical treatments to supplement fire quite often.
Kathy, can you talk about your organization and other organizations, just sort of the foundation of how that works around collaborating on protecting municipal water sources and infrastructure, and sort of maybe other examples that you're aware of in other parts of the country that do that sort of work? There were several questions about that.
Yeah, and some of the questions that, or one of the questions that somebody sent in ahead of time that jumped out at me was someone talked about there being a connection between source water protection plans and community wildfire protection plans. And I thought that was really smart. And it symbolizes what I'm trying to do, which is to bring together the different people from all the different organizations, find out who's going to first, what you're trying to accomplish, and then who else is trying to do things that are similar to that, who shares your audience, because you're going to want to participate and collaborate with them as well. And then look at who's going to benefit from the work that you're doing. And that's where you pull in the utilities and you pull in corporations, manufacturers that have big plants that are right next to your waterways, and bring them all together. And if you can do that, we start out typically at a state-based forum and develop a forest and water forum where people come and learn, and the forest people learn about the water people, the work that they're doing, and vice versa. And so bringing in the people together, it provides opportunities for collaboration that might not have happened otherwise. There was a member of the Forest Service in Texas, and he said, he was asked, what do you get out of participating in this? And he said that he gets a seat at the table when there's conversations that are taking place that before he might not have necessarily done that. So, the municipal water supply systems there, and they're having conversations about how to protect water quality. It hasn't always been intuitive to include the Forest Service into those conversations. So, that's happening a lot. And there's a lot of innovation that's taking place. And I would encourage everybody to think about innovation and what they can do just a little bit differently. And getting back to someone that's trying to link up the source water protection plans and community wildfire protection plans. And I think that's a great way of pulling out those mutual interests of two different parties, two different guidance documents, but people who are working toward that have similar objectives. Couple more examples. For many years, the city of San Antonio took 1/8 of 1 cent of their sales tax, and they put it into a pool of money that they were then able to use to protect and manage forest lands in their watershed. And also Central Arkansas Water, I already mentioned them before, but they were the first utility to do a green bond. And they were able to, it was a green bond that was certified, the first of its kind to acquire and protect forests specifically to support clean drinking water. So they're able then to use that money to do some of these protection and management programs.
I actually want to highlight that Arkansas example, Kathy, a little more, and be able to really drill that point of improving water quality. So, and you guys, any of you, but Kathy, maybe first expand on that water quality improvements due to prescribed fire, and if that example in Little Rock sort of been able to measure less, I think it's less total organic carbon, in their water supply over time, and they're attributing that to treatment. Is that, do you want to be able to, did that expand more on the green bond or the ability to be able to say this is an improvement to that watershed?
I can't speak to the specifics of what studies they use, let's say, to justify the activities that they're doing to the board that manages their utility, because they have to justify what they're doing, of course, and what they're spending this money on. So I don't know about the specifics that they use for that. Another good example, though, is also the Forest Resilience Bond, and that's out in California. And what they're able to do, it's another example of innovation and conservation finance on introducing some new technique to this. And so they're able to pool a bunch of money from investors and get to do a bunch of forest management protection work, wildfire prevention, prescribed burns. And they were able to do something like 12 years worth of work in 4 years because they had all of this money that came in to do that. And then over time, the investors are being paid back by the beneficiaries, which includes primarily 3 interesting ones: the state of California and the Yuba water supply, municipal water supply, and a beverage company. So they all understood the benefits that they were getting from that. But as far as specifics of quantifying them, I don't have that.
This is a great question from Elizabeth about, are localities actually required to do a source water protection plan, and how broad is that something you're familiar with, Kathy?
Say that again.
Are localities required to do source water protection plans? Do they do them annually? How often is that?
The states under the Safe Drinking Water Act are required to do a source water assessment plan, and then utilities are highly encouraged to develop source water protection plans. But I think there's only one state in the nation, West Virginia, that is a regulatory requirement that the utilities have to produce that. Well, within those source water protection plans, they have to identify threats to their water supply. So if there's a manufacturer that's right on the water and they're using certain chemicals, you have to be able to say, okay, what's going to happen if they do a spill? So the closer to their water intakes, that's their critical management zone. And then they rank the threats from there. If you've got a bunch of CAFOs that could possibly be doing something. What I've been talking to some people about is those source water protection plans, trying to identify within those, are they looking at forest loss, or forest conversion or the lack of forest management as an identified threat within their source water protection plan. So I think there's an opportunity to do that and to work within those plans to help promote more of the management side of the work.
So I have a just a comment about the measured improvement in water quality as a result of prescribed fire. I think that's phenomenal if they were able to see that and document that. I suspect, though, that in a lot of places that'd be a very hard thing to document with any level of confidence. But to me, that's not a reason not to do it, not to protect, not to manage, not to prescribe, because I think the appropriate comparison is what would the water quality be like if you didn't manage fuels for the prescribed fire and then there was a wildfire? To me, that's the appropriate comparison. Is it better than what would happen if there was a wildfire? And then just in general, I think the way to compare the management that Kathy talked about and how important that is a managed forest, even if you get a slight increase in sediment or whatever for management activities, the alternative is a parking lot or a development or any other land use that isn't forest. And to me, that's the appropriate is what is the benefit of managing, and we know that produces the highest water quality, managed or unmanaged, relative to not doing it, versus being able to see like a trend or an improvement over time in a managed watershed, because that's within the range of variability. It's hard to do, and a high bar, hard standard to reach. But comparing other alternatives, I think it's a very easy sell and factual.
And Jim, that gets back to you saying, look toward the future. So there's a Sebago, Portland, Maine, Sebago Clean Waters. They are one of, I think, 50 utilities that have a certain filtration exemption through the EPA. They don't have to do this particular step. And so they were looking at the future and saying, we want to keep that exemption. We want to protect our water. And then they looked around at the forests around their reservoir and said, okay, this X percentage of these forests need to be conserved, protected long-term, and X percent of these forests need to be managed to make them as healthy as possible. And prescribed burns being some of that management component. So they were able to then look to the future and avoid any potential impacts from that forest loss conversion or lack of management.
And I wanted to add on to Jim's point there's been some discussion of modeling in the comments too. That would be a great application of a model to where, we have this much of the watershed above our intake and what happens if it burns. And I've learned a lot in the comments in terms of people sharing different models that can potentially assess, changes in water quality, but that would be an ideal application for a watershed model that can look at fire and fire effects. Exactly what Jim talked about.
Speaking of that, there's a couple of questions here that if you all or anyone in chat can dig into a little bit. Lindsay has a question about ecosystem function in the National Wildfire Risk Assessment and Interagency Fuels Decision Support Software. So if there's some comments that you all can make about that, that would be great. I'll put that to the chat. And thanks for the comments, Chris, about state and federally supported and tribal plans. Let's see, we only have a few minutes left. This has flown by as always. So I'm gonna let each of you panelists, close out with anything you want to add, but I might grab one more question from the pre-submitted, which is just generally speaking, your insight on how lack of fire on the landscape throughout time affected water quality in the eastern U.S. Any final thoughts on just generally speaking lack of fire on the landscape impacts to water quality or quantity?
Well, this again is kind of a hard thing to prove at scale, but I do think there's a general consensus that one of the contributing factors to increasing mesification, or wet site species that use a little more water than dry site or xerophytic species, it was a result of lack of fire and a change in forest structure, greater density, greater water use by certain species, has contributed to an overall decline in stream flow. Again, very, very difficult to prove that definitively, but I think that the biology makes sense that it's probably true. Nutrient cycling, probably less of a direct connection in terms of water quality, unless these stands were more vulnerable to, tip up or things that would expose mineral soil. I think the lack of fire in the east has mainly been without wildfire. It's mainly been a water quantity effect, and then the water quality effect might be the fact that these stands, when they do burn, might be more severe and may wildfire and affect water quality.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of information on that with regards to water quality, but from a quantity point of view, our stream flow in this part of the world has decreased over the last 60, 70 years. That's been shown pretty conclusively. And
I think that, well,
a transition actually from hardwoods to conifers, or going back to conifers, which was our landscape at one point.
so
Sorry,
our ecosystem here was longleaf pine, 90 million acres, which is down to 4 million, and that stretched from Texas to Virginia. And so, yeah, we definitely think that the lack of fire in the landscape has had an impact. I don't think we've measured that impact on water quantity, but sort of some back of the envelope estimation that I've done. Of course, agriculture is the biggest factor in watershed I work in, and then there's climate change, of course, which is always going to be there. But if I had to estimate how much of our decline in stream flow was from the lack of fire, I would say about 30%. So over time, that's for us 40 to 50 millimeters of rainfall every year is lost now to excessive evapotranspiration, and that adds up over time. And we're seeing that in groundwater, we're seeing that in historic stream flows. So yeah, I think lack of fire in the landscapes had a major effect on our water quantity.
You talk about conifers too, you can add the process of interception to that as well. Big difference in interception between conifers and deciduous species.
But not all conifers are created equal.
Great session. We have 1 minute left. I'm just going to go to each of you for a closing comment. Also to the folks that are joining us, be sure to catch in the chat pod. We would ask for you to complete a quick survey that Craig has put in there. Know that this was recorded. It goes on to the Fueling Collab website. And of course, approved for CEUs by SAF. So just if you need that information, we've got that. Kathy, I'll go to you. Just anything you want to close with?
Just one final plug for collaboration, for just looking around and seeing who is sharing your audience, who has similar goals to you, and then also who's going to benefit from what you're doing, and get as many people around that table and as many varied perspectives as possible.
Thank you, Stephen.
Last plug is just thank you for bringing us together. Jen and Amanda and Maddie and Stephanie, of course, I think this has been a great chance to reach out and talk about fire amongst, in the East. So thank you.
You bet. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. It's been enjoyable to talk about it. And I think this is just such an important topic that's only going to get more important over time. And I won't be around to see it, but I'd be really curious to see something like this. Who knows what kind of technology reconvene in 30 years and see if these are the same issues, or if the world has changed so much and we've solved so many problems that maybe this doesn't need to be talked about in the future. But I think it will, and I think these kinds of venues sort of get people thinking about the future.
Closing thoughts, Randy.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, this is really illuminating, I guess, from many perspectives. I was just going to mention something very direct that's very pragmatic, and I don't know how you get over this challenge, but I've been a part of numerous prescribed fires from a research point of view, and teaching everyone, they're always postponed because we got to send the folks that are doing it from the east to the west. And so I don't know how we increase our workforce in the east to help us with fire related activities and research, but I think that would be a really important thing to consider into the future, especially considering our ecosystems are going to get more and more prone to fire.
Great point. Back to collaboration. Jen, I'm going to go to you. We're a little over, but it was just good stuff. So we'll close out. Thank you all four of you so much.
Yeah, that was, and if folks have to go, please feel free. But I just wanted to say thank you again. What a great panel. And thank you to all of our attendees. This discussion and the chat and the questions were incredible. I really appreciate the amount of time that we spent on actual application and planning here. That's what we like to see is fire science being used on the ground, right? And hopefully we'll see that soon. I did want to take just a minute to share, since this is our final fueling collaboration of the season. I wanted to say thanks again for just a great third season. Just another reminder that recordings will be available on the Fueling Collaboration website, fuelingcollab.com, and the CAFM's YouTube channel. And please send us your feedback. The evaluation will be available when you close Zoom. It's just 7 questions. It really gives us a lot of information for our planning purposes. And just a couple things, just so everybody knows, we prepared this document a couple weeks ago, just talking about fueling collaboration as a series. These numbers have gone up since we prepared it, but we received more than 10,000 registrations for this series over the past 3 seasons. We've received more than 2,200 questions. It says almost 3,000 attendees. I'm sure after this panel, we are well over 3,000. I think we were at 3,200 after the last one. And we have 10 recordings available as of right now, which there'll be 13, I think, available once we get all of them up from this season. But it's just been an incredible thing to be a part of. And please keep the feedback coming. Let us know what you think. We've got some great quotes here. We know that this is making an impact on the ground. And we will start thinking about season 4 very soon. So keep your inboxes posted, I guess, for that information. With that, I'll close it out. Thanks, y'all, for a great panel and a great season.